distant skies, firefight calls. The stakes are high, John the Slay, heroes and spies. Control fire, where strategy lies. Hear the tales, fierce and deep. Victors roar, defeated weep. We blaze away, we don't hold back. Control fire, ready to attack.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Controlled Fire, your monthly musings on Mantic's Firefight. I'm Sam.
I'm Mike. And I'm Luke.
Today we're going to be looking at list building. One of the frequent questions that we're asked and we talk about amongst ourselves is, what do you think of this list? So we thought today we'd talk about the sorts of things we do when we're building lists, work through what our processes are, some of the things we keep in the backs of our mind as we're putting lists together, so we can give you a distilled version of what is our approach to list building. Before we jump into exactly how we're going to be breaking down list building, we'll run to From the Forge. Mike, what are you working on at the moment?
I haven't really done much modelling since the last time we all got together to meet. I've mainly been running community events. I did a Dead Zone Day, and I've got a tournament coming up at the end of September, and then there's the one that we mentioned last time, which is the big one that's happening in January. And that organisation's taking a little bit of my time up to do that, which I do enjoy, but I'm just getting in the occasional game here and there to fill in that time.
Excellent. I should also say, if you'd like to hear some Controlled Fire content about community building and event planning, please let us know in the comments for the episode where we're keen to start exploring that area. What have you been up to, Luke?
Just more or less trickling through a few more Marauders. Not doing much hobby-wise at the moment due to other commitments, but yeah, getting through some of those Marauders.
Excellent. For myself, I'm still cruising through my Maison. They've been hitting the table a few times now. Also, in a shocking development, I'm also painting terrain, which those who know me is entirely out of character. I find painting terrain incredibly dull, but I am doing my best. I think some of it's in order to ensure we have enough boards for SpringCon. I'm planning on bringing one along. And I want it to be painted, so I am gritting my teeth and painting terrain right now. The other thing that also has me very excited is I'm about to take delivery of a 3D printer, and I've got my Vault subscription. I'm about to jump on the Mantic Vault bandwagon. That also has me very excited as well.
Is that also to print out the epic scale Warpath?
Well, yes, because my Kickstarter will be arriving early next year for Epic Warpath. Very much looking forward to that. But it's also for all the beautification of the Firefight units. I'm thinking particularly those mule crews. I'd love to have ghouls sitting in the back tray of the mule, all raising weapons in the air, firing randomly and so on, or some Maison guys sitting in the back of the tray looking very dour. I think that'd be great. Very excited. I know probably a lot of our listeners are probably also 3D printers. I'm excited to be joining your ranks. So let's jump into list building. So before we dive into it, Luke, do you want to chat us through why you think list building matters?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, list building is the process by which you decide what you want to bring to the table for a battle or a series of battles. Think about sort of what models you've got versus what you need. List building kind of matters as a process because you're going to be facing down an opponent. Your opponent's going to have a game plan. They're going to have certain things that they're putting on the board. And you have to decide in advance of the game, what can I bring to take them down and score those objectives and thwart any plans that they've got. There's two sorts of main ways I think you can look at list building. There's the all-comers list and there's the tailored list. So what we mean by this is the difference between, are you making a list which is tailored to play against a known opponent, or are you building a list that can be competitive against any list? For me, I always make all-comers lists, even if I think I know what my opponent's going to be playing. Because not only does that help you get better in general list-building principles, it helps you hone your skills to not be guaranteed to have every answer you need against a certain list. You kind of have to think about, all the things that you could be facing and how you might play against them.
And I imagine for things like for tournament play or for events, you're going to need an all-comers list anyway, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think, particularly with the state of Firefight at the moment, maybe tournaments aren't, big on everyone's radar in terms of games they might be playing. So So, I just sort of more think about, going to club days or playing with a pool of opponents. But absolutely, if you're going to events, all comers is kind of the list type you have to have because, anything could come up on the other side of the table. So what do you guys think? Do you tend to only build all comers or do you sometimes tailor lists?
I'm same as you. I'm always all comers. I actually, unless your opponent also agrees to build a tailored list, that doesn't great way with me if someone's building a list to exactly knowing that I only have enforcers or forge fathers and that's what they want to, they're building, tailoring a list for that. My lists are nearly always all comers lists, and generally if look again for tournaments, as you said, it has to be all comers. You need to have an option to be able to deal with nearly anything that's going to come across on the other side of the table. So I can't even remember the last time I ever built a list for any system actually to take on an individual opponent.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, for myself, I'm the same. Like even if I know I'm going to be facing Forge Fathers, it's not like I'll immediately start stacking in a bunch of extra anti-tank, even though that probably would be very clever to do so. But that's assuming a known opponent. Probably the only time I would do a tailored list is in a campaign setting where it's then thematic to the event. So I can theme that way, but I don't want to have the way I'm playing dictated to me by what my opponent is doing.
Yeah, and I think that encourages then that you're building a list that you want to play. Like you hear like in sporting teams all the time, they say, "Oh, we don't care what the opposition is doing; we're just thinking about ourselves." And I think it's a very similar concept here when you're dealing with an all-comers list. You're just looking at what can my list do and how am I going to deal with a particular race, but you don't really know what you're going to face against.
Yeah, you're focusing on your own game plan.
Yes. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, you kind of start to ask yourself that what if question then. What if I play against Asterians when I'm used to using pinning weapons? What if I face Forge Fathers when I don't typically bring much anti-tank? So just before we delve into some of the more specific things about this building, I did kind of want to talk quickly about stats and why they matter. And by stats here, I don't mean unit stat lines. I specifically mean things like how many drops you have, how many shoot and assault dice, their average AP, those sorts of things you find down the bottom of the companion app.
Mm-hmm.
So these stats give you a kind of a comparative number to think about. So while it doesn't tell you the whole story, it can give you some sorts of ideas about comparisons between lists that you might play and lists that other people might play. Do you guys pay any attention to these numbers?
To some bits. I mean, certainly the drop count, definitely, because that leans very strongly into objective play. In terms of things like average AP, that can be interpreted in so many different ways. Like if you have a number of units which have a lot of AP1 melee weapons, for example, that's very different to having none, but then a few concentrated AP4. They're going to play very, very differently. I don't find that a metric as a particularly useful one, but the drop count certainly.
The person who kind of mentioned that there was 100 wounds Marauder list on the last podcast, I think the answer would be yes, I do look at those particular numbers. And you're right, it doesn't paint a big picture, but on the other side, I think just to go back on the AP bit is like, again, being a Forge Fathers player, I know I'm going to have less dice, but I know those dice are going to have a better chance to wound because the armor penetration's there. So generally it's more than one AP, where you're looking at some other lists, and most Marauder lists have less than that, except for one person who had nearly a whole one on their list, but still. So it is kind of still sitting there. But yeah, I look at those basic numbers at the end to have a look at how many dice you're going to be rolling.
I mean, I probably look more in the Firefight dice tools where you can go, can you give me a rough idea of points per wound in order to give me an indication of how killy this unit is? In terms of, for points spend, how much is it going to kill? That said, that's still a very, very blunt measure. I much prefer putting all the things as a Monte Carlo simulation into R and running it for my units in order so I can see what the damage spread is likely to be. But that's my way of statsing, and I know people have different ways on it.
Yeah, for me, I kind of use the numbers as a retrospective tool when comparing different builds of mine that are similar. So I kind of, peruse down the bottom and just sort of look at where I landed with this particular list, and I compare it to other lists that I do that are similar to those. But also, and we're going to touch on archetypes in a moment, I actually find it very interesting to compare these stats across factions when trying to build similar style lists to lists in other factions. And it kind of helps you lean towards different factions if you want to be doing certain things a bit better. I guess that's a good segue into archetypes.
We'll talk about a few of them, and some of the factions overall they lean into generally one of these particular archetypes that we're going to talk about in each case. But I think it's also important to note that you can build just about anything in each particular list for each faction, or just that, we're generally probably better off leaning into what they're good at. But you can certainly build different types as you go through, and everything can kind of do it along the lines. But the big one, I guess, is the shooting versus melee. Like how many people are in your army is going to be shooting? How much? So they want to get into hand fighting. There's generally a roughly even split of the factions that want to do each of those throughout the whole lot of 9 to go through. Again, you got Horde versus Elite, so which is another different type. But you can certainly have, for instance, GCPS will probably be more known for the Horde shooting, and then you're probably looking at Veermen or Plague for Horde melee. You can mix them together and to come through those. Whether you're not how mobile you want your army to be. I've often complained about how immobile I think Forge Fathers are. But then you can have others that are actually very mobile. You generally have quite speedy troops or very good transports. Again, I think I mentioned probably I like playing the Enforcers as a difference because they are both mobile and shooty in there. I'm enjoying that change away from Forge Fathers at the moment. So what are you guys' thoughts on those different archetypes?
Yeah, importantly, you can have combinations of those. You can have a mobile melee Horde army or an elite shooting gun line. There's different combinations of those archetypes that are possible. I think it's good to think about the archetypes because it helps you understand the strengths of the archetypes in different lists. So you know when to lean into certain archetypes, or when you're trying to break the mold, what you need to look for to break that mold. You can do a shooty Plague list, for example, but you have to sort of recognize that that's what you're going for and push certain things down certain paths to make up for the deficiencies in the list for that archetype in general. So absolutely, I think every list can pretty much do every archetype to some degree. Maybe Horde versus Elite would be the one that some, certain lists would struggle with. But even Veermen can do a fairly elite army. They can take, the 5-man Maligny as their unlocks and go lots of tunnelers and lots of terrors and nightmares and sort of go very elite that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Plague, I won't say that Plague could ever be a shooting skew army. They can certainly do an army with more shooting in it than people are expecting. But for a lot of these, you probably are going to be leaning into the strengths of the archetype that your faction favors. And a lot of it will be knowing what are generally the counters to that archetype and what you're going to do to counter those counters. So we were chatting last episode, Marauders can, if they want to, do a very potent melee game plan. But of course, a good counter to melee is pin, because it slows you down and prevents you charging. Well, we know that Marauders have some excellent counters to pin. Similarly, Plague have some excellent counters to pin with things like unflinching and so on. So it's knowing your archetype and knowing what works against that archetype and how you can then work against what's going to work against you. So let's start jumping into some of our list building questions. And once we go through some of the things like what size units and how many units we should be taking, we might have a bit of a chat through what are our own personal approaches to list building. Luke, you were mentioning just before, one of the stats you look at is number of drops. How many drops do you think people should be looking for an army?
Well, in true consultant fashion, it depends. Obviously, elite armies are going to tend towards the lower drop count, so they can't aim for that 15 to 17 mark that some of the more Horde armies would be looking for. I think in general, high drop counts, post-command protocols are better. You do have, as we talked about in episode 1 on the command protocols changes, that decision to make about, is it better to out-activate your opponent, to run out their activations so that you can do things without them being able to do anything to thwart you? Or is it better to activate quicker and seize the initiative for next turn to be able to choose to go first or second? It's my strong opinion that that you want to be having as much time on the board where your opponent's not activating things and you are. So it is better to have more drops by a fair margin, I think, in command protocols. But, some people will have, 1 or 2 units that make a massive impact if they can go first and choose their targets. So they may wish to actually go first. The other sort of how many question, I guess, beyond drop count is how many thumbs, butts, and legs you've got.
Yeah.
So if you've listened to episode 2, Stay on Target, Sam's gone through and explained what we mean by thumbs, butts, and legs. But, more specifically, when we ask the how many question in list building, we're going to be asking how many thumbs, so how many things can score objectives.
And HVAs.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I mean, it is one of the things I find often with my Plague and Maison lists is because there are a lot of beasts and you can take a lot of vehicles in that list, and it's very easy to find yourself stuck with not enough thumbs. And if your units who are able to score objectives, your units who aren't beasts and vehicles get taken out, you can find yourself having a really tough time playing that game. One of the things I know I'll come to this when we do personal list building. One of the things I always do at the end of building a list is I go through and review, like, how many thumbs do I have in my units? Do I need to take out some of these units with beasts or take out some of these vehicles in order to make sure I'm going to be able to play the objective for this?
I guess I know we're going to cover it a bit more, but for me, when I'm looking at the list, I generally go back to, again, the scenarios. And there's two main scenarios that I'll look at, and that's control the vans. So I need some units to sit in my back line to sit onto the rear objectives. They may or may not do something, so I don't want those to be particularly expensive. And the other one is extraction, which is I need to get to the middle of the table as fast as I possibly can to grab those people to be able to, the HVAs, high-value assets, to take them away. For me, I look at those two things as far as the scenario is concerned, and that's the main 2 scenarios I want to try to cover, because I feel most of the others you can kind of cover after that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just to round out the drop count discussion then, my rule of thumbs, I guess, for an elite army at 1,500 points, which is what we typically play here, would be, aiming for at least 11 drops where possible. You'd have to have some really good reasons to go for 10 or less. I think for 1,250, which is more common around the world, 10 drops would be the aim for an elite army. And by elite, I generally just mean Forge Fathers and Enforcers. For most other armies at 1,250, I'll be saying you probably want at least 14 drops, and at 1,500, 15 drops. So if I do a Marauder list and I've got 15 drops at 1,500, I'm quite happy with that. I do really like some of the lists that I do that are 16 or 17 drops, mostly because those drop counts are pumped up by mules and weapons teams, which are all fantastic. But yeah, sort of those extra activations at that level really do help.
I mean, in a similar rule of thumb for me, I'll generally try and make sure I've got at least 7 or 8 thumbs, so units that are actually able to score objectives. I mean, for my Plague list, for example, I often have 15 drops, but I've only really got 8 thumbs in. So that's kind of my rule of thumb. This is building at 1,500 points, of course. So.
Yeah, I think 6 thumbs is a minimum, like a bare minimum.
Yeah.
And then, if at least 5 of those are good thumbs, they're really good at holding objectives, then you can kind of have 3, 4, 5 sort of backup thumbs. So, like your command units and that sort of thing they can hold things, but it's typically not what they want to be doing.
Sure. Well, I guess that the other side of the coin from having lots of units is having large units. So what do we think is the right size for a unit?
On the consultant, it depends. When I am looking at GCPS as well at the moment, and for me that's at least units of 10 for the Marines going through there. But generally with the Forge Fathers, I'd be lucky to have more than 5 or 6 in an individual unit, unless I'm talking about taking militia or rockets. Then that's another one going up to around about 10. So I'm guessing in general, saying it out loud, the lower armoured and lower shot units I tend to take more off in that space. So it's always going to be that particular case. It's not very often I have a large unit of like Thorgarum, which are expensive because it's like nearly 300 points in that, which is going to be around about a third or so of your list. So
absolutely. I mean, I do like that there's a bit of a push and pull in different kinds of efficiencies for unit size. So, I mean, if you go a large unit, that means if you hit that unit with an order, that's a much more effective use of that order because it's affecting more models. It's going to have a greater impact on the game. But you've got the counter efficiencies there of that if that unit were 2 smaller units, that would be possibly twice as much unit strength, an extra thumb on the board. And also, and if they're troops, it could also be unlocks as well. So I do like that it's pushing you one way and pulling you the other. So it's depending what you want them to do in the game in some ways is going to be determining what's the right size for this unit.
Yeah, efficiency of activation, be that for an order or just what they're doing without an order, is quite important. And that kind of sounds like the antithesis of the point I was just making about wanting lots of drop. But, you can see, I guess, why I gravitate towards, armies like Marauders and Vermin that I think can have both high drop count and high efficiency of activation. I think in that vein, you want everything to be as big as possible before there's some hindrance to doing so. So, what are those hindrances? Obviously, if they need to go on the transport, the cap of the transport is the hindrance. Maybe it's just a very expensive unit like tunnel runners, where taking the full count of tunnel runners is mightily expensive and you just can't justify that cost. Or maybe, to use Vermin as an example again, maybe you want to be running 3 tunnelers and you need 6 units to unlock those. And that starts to become very, very expensive. So now you need to play sort of smaller units to, as cheap unlocks to unlock the filth. That's another good reason to not run full units. I think outside of those reasons, you almost always want to be running as big a unit as you can, particularly those armies that have overwhelm on them.
So I'd like to explore something which is, I think, a little unique to Firefight, something that I call drop cost, which is effectively what is the cost of getting this unit on the board if it had no models in it. This is because a lot of the units in Firefight, which I think are tended to be skewed towards the large side, actually have a lot of their points front-loaded. So that means if you're taking small units of those, you're doing so very, very inefficiently. Probably a big example of this is the Plague Ghouls. To get a unit of 5 ghouls onto the board is 75 points. To actually buy an extra ghoul for that unit is only 6 points. So if we think that that's 30 points of ghouls in that unit, then that means you're paying a drop cost of 45 points to have an empty unit of ghouls on the board. Alternatively, you can flick it as thinking that I'm actually paying far, far too many points per model if I'm just taking a 5-person unit of ghouls. So you are heartily encouraged to run large units of ghouls. This is one of the numbers I sort of crunch on most of my takes. Another good example is GCPS Marines. There you pay 90 points to get 10 models on the board, but then only pay 6 points per model in order to get them on. That means the drop cost of that unit is 30 points. An empty unit of Marines, no one in it, would be 30 points. So if you're taking just the bare bones unit, you're actually paying 9 points a model for that unit, whereas to add on, it's 6 points a model. You get an excellent discount there. A really good comparison to the GCPS is the marionettes. Asterian marionettes and GCPS Marines actually have almost identical stat lines, except that the marionettes have construct. One of the main differences in list building is that for marionettes, you actually pay 60 points in order to get 5 marionettes, so their drop cost is only 10, but then you have to pay 10 points per model to add marionettes into that unit. That means that you're encouraged to be running large units of Marines. You're going to be getting a points discount on every extra model, but at 10 points a model for each extra marionette, there's not really too much utility in actually making those marionette units large from a raw points efficiency point of view. Of course, there absolutely is in other ways, things like I want to have order efficiency, but in terms of points efficiency, you don't get the same kind of discounts as you'd get. So I've dubbed this kind of thing drop costs, and I normally calculate it by multiplying up what are the cost of the models in the unit, and then subtract that from the actual cost. That tells me how much an empty unit of this costs, and that tells me from a raw points efficiency point of view, how big should I be making these units? Do you guys calculate anything like that? I know your drop costs are generally 10 for almost all of your units. you don't have quite as many of these horde things?
I mean, I don't think I tend to worry about it to that degree. I'm looking for a unit to be providing something when I take it. Either it's there purely to unlock, in which case I'm taking a minimum or close to minimum unit anyway, or I'm looking for it to be efficient when I activate it. And there's kind of like, I think I just look at the overall cost and justify the unit that I'm taking based on that rather than analyzing the drop cost. But I think it is a really good way to think about it, particularly when it comes to thinking about units for unlocks. Because the marionettes now become a very, very good unlocking unit.
Absolutely, they've got such a low drop cost.
Exactly, and you can start from the foundation of I'm just going to take minimum units to unlock what I need to unlock, and then any leftover points can be thrown for extra models. But you don't feel hard done by if you can't scrounge those points out for those extra models because it was effectively so cheap for that small minimum unit anyway.
And you absolutely can if the drop costs are small. I guess, I mean, if you're hunting unlocks in Plague, say, you'd never run a 5-person unit of ghouls. That's so points inefficient per model.
Yeah, and with the cost that you 75 points for something that's going to have 5 wounds on armor 5 and die pretty easily.
With shoot 6 and a no AP gun? Yeah, I mean, you'd never pay that.
They can't achieve anything by themselves and they accept dying really easily.
So one of my other rules of thumb that I do in list building is evens over odds, and I don't know if you pay quite as much attention to this as I do, and that is that the even model counts are better than odd model counts purely from a breakpoint perspective, in that a unit breaks when it goes below half strength. That means the even model you buy in a squad is worth more than the odd model you buy in the squad. The odd model will contribute an extra attack and an extra body on the pitch. The even one will also take you higher on your unit before it breaks.
It's funny, I don't think I've consciously ever done it necessarily, but thinking back, I don't think I've ever taken brawlers or commandos in odd numbers except for that one brawler unit that I put in a mule that has a spare spot for an HVA. I think every time I take them is always an even number.
And you may just be doing it subconsciously because you know it's better on the break. But if you look at any of my lists, you'll see that almost all my units are even counts. And I find it hard to not do that now.
Well, and now I'm going to find it hard not to do that.
Because the even model is a more valuable model than the odd one.
Yeah.
I sort of do that. It depends. Again, going through the old state, it depends. It's like with enforcers, I do tend to do it. I don't tend to do it with Forge Fathers because I tend to find my points so limited that I got to just take the minimum unit of 5, and they're all generally minimum units of 5. But after saying that, I normally do my drop troopers at 6. So I do. So if I get the opportunity to do it, I will. But it's not a deal breaker for me.
See, for mine, it's like going from a unit of 5 to a unit of 6 is it just feels so much better because you need to lose 4 models out of that squad in order to break it then, rather than just 3. And you're then only, 1 further away from last man standing and 1 more from total unit death. It doesn't really matter at that point anymore.
I mean, I guess it would probably come out inherently in some people's lists. Take a unit that can run 8 men, for example. Would you run 2 units of 7? No, everyone would run an 8 and a 6, I think.
Yeah.
So I think it accidentally happens to most people regardless.
Interesting. While we're also talking on this, for the larger multi-wound units, I'm thinking things like Ripper Maulers and Rainmakers and Nightmares. We discussed, I think, in episode 2, the problems of small units of that. You lose 1 model and suddenly your last man standing and unit strength 0. Is that something you plan for in your list building?
I don't think I'd plan for it. I just, lament that it's the case. So in the end, just that. I mean, if they've got thumbs, they've still got thumbs. They just don't add the unit strength to things that count unit strength. It's not the end of the world. There's a lot of scenarios where it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
It just, it kind of sucks on those few that it does.
Similar situation. I'm conscious of it, but I wouldn't say it's going to stop me from doing something because there's advantages. It's a drop. It's an activation. There's a number of advantages you still get to having a small unit of 2 models. That's reasonably tough to not necessarily worry about it too much.
Mm-hmm.
I think in armies that can get like regen or heal, it's a lot less of a problem as well because you can target those heals or, that order that gives regen or whatever it is to get back the wounds on that unit to get them back to 2 models. So that's really cool. But, there's plenty of armies that can't do that. So
Well, we've talked a bit about how many units you should be getting on the board and how big you should make your units. And Mike, how do you go about determining what kind of units you take?
So I think you guys are a lot more into the maths of this than I am. Like, I think I'm a much more casual player than the pair of you two overall.
You don't do box plots?
No. Although I'm very happy for you to do them for me. But I think it's more a case of, in general, for me, I mentioned, I go back to thinking about particularly those two scenarios, and the only other thing I would really add in on top of that is like, do I have something I can leave behind for controlled advance? So like if I have to hide that objective behind a piece of terrain and therefore the unit's not going to be able to see or do anything for the whole game, I'm happy to leave that there. And then again, I want something that has some kind of form of speed in it, so I can get to extraction. I've got to get halfway across the board ASAP.
Make sure you got your legs in there.
That's right, got the legs. Those are the two first things that I probably have in my mind when I'm looking at it. And the last one is, do I have enough anti-tank to deal with the armor on the other side? And then once I've got those three questions solved in my head, I then would start to have a look at what else do I want to put in the list. And then for me, it generally comes down to, what models haven't I played with last?
Yeah.
So, like, if I went to a tournament and I had Thorgarum in the list, I guarantee you the next 2 or 3 games, and even casually, I'll be playing with Brockers instead because I had them painted, they're there, and that's what I'm going to take. But they feel similar roles to me, and that's kind of where I kind of go to. And I guess it depends whether or not I'm building a list then to competitive stakes, or am I building one for like casual stakes and for that. So generally, that's where I sit.
So you mentioned making sure you've got units to fulfill certain roles, and I guess the Thorgrim and Brockers, that they do similar things but in different ways. Are there other kind of roles you try to make sure you have filled when you're building a list?
Yeah, not generally, no. As I said, if I can cover those other bases, because then it kind of goes, okay, I'm shooting, am I melee, or am I doing what? I might decide to have a counter-attacking unit in there. I guess for me, I generally don't get to have a lot of stuff because I'm playing those elite armies. Yeah. So generally, it's like, okay, I have 2 units of Steel Warriors in my Forge Fathers list, and if that's going to be my base of my fire base, they're a bit too expensive to be sitting back on the back line, so I might have to start looking at a small unit of Brockers or Rakia to be able to sit on the back line, or potentially a militia is probably even slightly more expensive to be doing that. So I kind of get a bit limited to be able to do all of those sorts of things. But I do look at, I need speed. So therefore, yes, Hammerfist Drop Troopers is one of the first units I pick. Then Brocker Bikes is potentially one of the other units in there because it's got the speed to be able to get in there. The Draco transport is okay, but it's not as fast as mules or Arbiters, etc. Like, they can get up the board, they can move 12 18, so they're easily going to get up the board. So I kind of have a look at that from that perspective, and then from there I lean into generally what the list does best, or the faction does best. So yeah, I'm going to start taking things like Forge Guard, because you don't get any more Forge Fathery than Forge Guard. It's sitting there with like armor 7, 10 average generation for leaders nearby, and it's heavy armor, and it's 2 wins each. Go for your life, pour all your fire into it. Go for it. That's exactly what it's sitting there for. And generally that might be the only thing, because that's kind of where I'm going to try to march up the field. I'll eat most of the time. If I take that unit, I sprint at turn 1 because it moves 10. I'm not bothered shooting, but even fighting, it's got like 3 dice from memory in combat, and fighting on 3s. Like, you go for it.
But they really are an anvil's anvil, that unit.
That's it. So that's kind of what I'm sort of looking at then, is it's something else to sit there and have a presence on the table. And you want to fight me, that generally how that unit wins is because you just bounce off.
Yeah.
And
I'm aware.
So that's kind of where I'll be looking at. Yes, those other scenarios. That's where it comes into those other scenarios. I know that unit can be sprinted and go up to things like manpower. I don't have as much manpower, but I'm hoping to outlast you. So Sam, you said you've faced the wonderful Forge Guard. What are your thoughts on how you handle all those?
I mean, I guess my approach to building a list is, I'll normally start with commanders and support, mostly just because support determines the number of troop slots I need to have. If I'm going to be running 2 support, then I know I'm going to need 4 troops at minimum. If I'm going to be running 3 support, I have to find a way to fit in 6 unlocking troops, which is sometimes a bit of a stretch. But so I'll normally start there. I'll also tend to look at what are the mini synergies with my commander. This is super simple in Asterians just because every commander in Asterian, their order really only works on a very small subset of units in the Asterian list. If you're taking the Kalishi leader, their order only applies to other Kalishi. You're probably putting some extra Kalishi in your list. The Matsudan leaders, their orders only apply to Matsudan. So you're starting to think about those kind of mini synergies. As I'll tend to sort of assemble mini strike forces in my head of, okay, so these units are going to be deploying together because they've got the sort of synergy bubbles around them here. I'll also try and make sure I'm not lumping everything in together because I'm not trying to create one enormous Death Star. I'm wanting to create multiple mobile things which are supporting each other whenever I'm building something. This can be something as simple as I'm buying a transport. What unit am I going to be putting in this transport? And you're buying that at the same time. So that's generally the way I'll go. I'm creating little mini strike forces. As I mentioned earlier, once I put everything together, I'll double check to make sure I've got enough thumbs, butts, and legs. So I will double check to see how my unit strength is looking for Plague and Maison particularly. I go back and double check and make sure I've got enough thumbs that I'm actually able to score on objectives. And like you, I'm also going to build a game plan particularly for Controlled Advance because I need to make sure I've got 2 backfield units. In my Asterians, I'm going to buy 2 60-point units of marionettes, park them on there, and there we go. That's going to be my backfield objective holders there. Their job is just to live. So, I mean, I guess one of the things I think of is when I'm putting the units in the list, thinking about what the unit is for. Some of my units are there to kill, and that's basically it. I'm thinking things like Plague Aberrations, Plague Zombies. Their job is basically to go in there and just absolutely wreck face. Similarly, the Asterian weapons platforms are probably in there more to kill. I'm not necessarily expecting them to survive because they're a little bit flimsy. I've also got units whose jobs purely is just to live. They don't need to do anything else except exist. And as long as they remain existing, they've done their job because they're parked on an objective while more important units do their thing. Some other units, their job is to get other units up the board, things like transports, but knowing for each of my units that each of them has a role in the list. So for Controlled Advance, I make sure I've got a game plan. Manpower, I'll also plan out as well to make sure that I've got either some overwhelm units or when I'm building those mini strike forces that I paired a unit strength 2 unit with a unit strength 1 unit. So I hit that magical unit strength 3 to score each objective for 2 points rather than 1. And of course, you have to build a game plan, I feel, for escalation, making sure you're claiming turn 1 and for bodyguard. That's generally my approach to list building. Luke, is that similar to yours?
In a way, I guess I tend to start with a core strategy for a list first. I don't look at the specific units to begin with. I go with the core strategy, which may include units. So it's either I want to play a certain way, or I'm intending to make a certain unit or combination of units work. Things like brawlers and mules is a not very obvious one, but other times there's things like trios of shield tunnelers to all distribute shields amongst themselves. That's a strategy, right? So to play that strategy, you start with 3 tunnelers, and then you have to figure out how the heck
how do I fit in 3 tunnelers?
How the heck to build in the rest of the list from there. So it's always a strategy, and sometimes the strategy is just, hey, I've just noticed this unit looks really cool, but it's got these deficiencies, so I need to now, if I want to take 2 of these, I've got to make up for those in other ways. So once I know that core strategy and take those units that fill that, I fill it in with commanders that support the strategy, and then I make sure that I've got enough ranged anti-tank, because I think 2 to 3 ranged anti-tank is a near must for an all-comers, or at least the way that I play. The point there is now those things are not something you generally have to worry about. It's just one thing that the opponent can do that you don't really need to worry about anymore because their tanks are all going to die.
Or be pinned and operating less optimally.
Or be having to shoot at your anti-tank stuff, to try and take it off before you can take them off, in which case the rest of your units are sort of trundling forward.
And it has to be ranged anti-tank. You're not rating melee anti-tank options being able to fill that role?
I think they're good. They're just not the types of armies I tend to play. Even in Marauders, there's enough anti-tank, melee stuff, but I tend to use melee more as a support for my lists than as the core strategy. So after I sort of take those things, I just fill in the gaps with things that I think are needed to cover off any deficiencies for an all-comers. So maybe I need another couple of extra units that can sit back on objectives and still be able to shoot at range, or some tech like unpinning or something like that I'm missing in the list. So there are some specific things I look for. So drop count, like I said, post CP, I like to have at least 14 drops for 1,500 points, or 12 for elite. For command units, I like 3 for most, but 2 is fine for enforcers. I think pretty much everyone else at 1,500, which is what I tend to play. 3 is really what you want.
Yeah.
Ranged anti-tank, as I said, like to have 3, but I'll settle for 2 if I have something like missile launcher weapons teams, or enough commando units with missile launchers.
Can I ask if it has to be anti-tank?
No,
or whether it just needs to be high AP?
So I think that you want at least 2 that are anti-tank AP. But I'm happy if my third is not necessarily anti-tank, but can throw out enough dice, for example, that it still can sneak 1 or 2 through. And then from there, missions, like you guys said, just making sure that I know who's going to be carrying high-value assets or sitting on objectives in each scenario, and just have a quick think and say, do I really suck at playing any of these missions? If the answer is yes, well, maybe change something up to support it. Otherwise, roll on. Sam, you mentioned the, what's the unit for question. And that is something that I ask myself for each unit. So, there's scenario play versus, killing or threat control. And I do think about that quite a bit. Some units fit squarely into one role or another. So they are just a cheap unit that sits on an objective or something like that. Or it's, a beast and it's only there to kill because it has no other purpose. It's there to look cool as well, okay? That's 2 purposes. But some, I might take for a particular reason. They're kind of a backup for another. So Hulks, I take for killing. But they're a good backup objective holder.
They have thumbs and butts.
Yeah, so they could do all those things. I tend to find that they're targeted quite a bit more in a lot of cases than something like commandos that are my objective holders. So they're not primarily to do that, but I know that in a pinch they can do that. The last thing that I do is it's not about what to take in a list, but I do think back to recent games and the efficacy of different units at what sizes I took them in that game. So that's why, if you face me in a friendly game, you'll almost always see me run something a little bit different to last time, even if the core of the list is the same. It's because I'm testing out, how different things fit into my list and style, and I'll continually take just little tweaks and changes as I go until I settle on something that I really like.
Yeah, one of the tournaments I went to, I deliberately, all but one unit in the list was less than 150 points. And I did that deliberately so that if I was to lose a particular unit, and it was just reminded me when you were talking about Death Stars before.
Yeah.
That I was trying to do the complete opposite to that. I didn't want to put all my eggs in one basket. I wanted to make sure that if I lost a unit, it didn't really matter too much because there's other units there. Mm-hmm. But in general, there was multiples of similar units. So if there was 3 units of Steel Warriors, for example, and there was 2 units of Forge Guard that was in that particular list. This was pre-CP as well, so that because it might not work out to be 150 points anymore. But I was just saying that it was a design choice not to have too many eggs in a single basket. Do you guys? But I did also have a Death Star because there was a 200-point unit of Thorgarum in there with a Drakkar, which takes it to nearly 300 points. So there was one Death Star, but everything else was.
I like that there's an exception that proves the rule here.
The thing that's kind of went there is because there was 10 units of Thorgarum inside the Drakkar, and there's this 300-point unit. You want it, you can come go for it, while the rest of it whittles you away. But the important pieces of the whole army were all less than 150 points to be able to go forth and grab it. Is that anything that you guys would have ever considered, or?
I mean, the redundancy thing, yes, except for some of those more expensive support items where you can't really be taking 2. Maybe not, but in general, my lists have the built-in redundancy. So the 2 or 3 of something if I need that unit there to do something. In terms of the total cost per unit, I kind of applied different values, but it's funny you say that because in Kings of War, I definitely look at things like, this is an expensive unit, but I can afford to take that slightly above cost unit to do something really good, because I'm taking this other, in my opinion, under costed unit that balances itself out over the list. So I kind of do give that thought process to how many points are in each drop in that game. But in Firefight, yeah, not really. I mean, I think, I definitely notice if something's very expensive, and then I may start to think about, well, what can I get? I said before, I'm a bit of a min-maxer. What can I get that can do what I need that unit to do, that may be deficient in another way, but less expensive, but not really sort of, trying to cap my points per unit.
Yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't do it as a points cap. I'd probably come at it as a far brutaler way of building units into my list whose job is to die. And then doing my best to make sure that it's those units that die rather than other ones. So rather than going, well, I'll have redundancy. I know it is this unit. Please shoot this 30-strong unit of plague zombies for me. And you can't ignore them, but it's also they're cheap as, and I've probably got another unit anyway. And the unit of leapers, they're going to die by the end of the game. They're barreled up in that mule, but their job is to wreak as much distraction in your line before they go down as possible. So I think less of keeping units under a certain point threshold and more like, I accept that these units are going to die, and hopefully if they do their job, all these other ones live. I guess if we're also thinking about up-pointing units, well, how do we go with choosing unit upgrades?
I think upgrades, I've always said Steel Warriors should have 2 Mjolnirs or you don't take them at all. So sometimes I think that these units are, to get efficiency out of them, then you need to go ham on the weapons upgrades. For most of the others, I think it becomes integral to how you plan to use the unit, but it almost feels like just enough. There's some units that can take multiple heavy weapons.
Yep.
You can take 2 of a special weapon in a unit. When I think about pinning weapons, I would tend to not do that with those.
Because you don't get utility for the second weapon beyond further assuring the one hit you need.
A couple of extra dice, but also for more points. And then usually these are the units that have trademark weapons, so they have orders that you want to be using on trademark weapons, so you get less utility out of those. So something like a HMG or whatever, a second one is probably not necessary, but one is definitely integral to how the unit works, and you just automatically factor that into the unit. If I'm taking 3 units of commandos, I'm taking at least 2 of them with HMGs, and that's just a given. When it comes to the other weapons types, I think it kind of depends on a few things about how many you would take and then if you take them at all. Grenade launchers I think are a 2 or none kind of proposition because they don't shoot that well. So if you're taking one, it's such a YOLO to maybe get D4 hits.
It really does depend on the faction though, because of course with GCPS you can get weight of fire into that unit very simply. And if your weight of firing on the grenade launcher hit, that's pretty effective.
True.
I find doing weapon upgrades on the units with a high drop cost is actually harder until you've already got to the full unit size, just because adding on extra models into that unit is generally a far more points-effective way to get the extra shots or the extra damage than actually upgrading the weapons. I mean, I guess if I think Plague, for example, I could buy almost 2 ghouls for the cost of adding a grenade launcher in. I'd much rather have the extra 2 bodies and the extra 2 shots hitting on 6s than 1 shot on 6 that explodes to a D4 with nothing else to boost that. You're always going to go the extra ghouls instead, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably the reason with grenade launchers in particular is because they don't do anything other than potentially more damage. Whereas, a weapon that pins infantry or a weapon that can pin a tank or an aircraft is a reason to take that weapon, more so than the pure damage output that it gives.
And it burns. I mean, it has a similar, though different effect to pinning weapons in that you hit with it and then that forces a nerve check on the unit that you hit as to whether they're then marked as activated, which is a awesome effect if you can get it to fire. But of course, with a nerve check, and there might be inspiring nearby.
Yeah, and so other examples, I guess, of special weapons you may consider not taking, besides the Morbius bombs we discussed last episode. What is the scythes on the scarecrows? Is there much point in taking scythes before you've filled out your unit? Similarly, brawlers with the ribbit talons, if you aren't putting them in a transport, in which case, you are capped on unit size. Is it worth spending the points on the repetalons before, just getting more bodies until you fill out the maximum body count?
You'll always go boys over toys generally.
Unless there's a reason to keep the drops low.
Yeah.
Or if it's not adding something in particular, as I said, like pinning, then yeah, boys over toys.
Depends. I've been finding myself with Enforcer operatives, for example, not taking special weapons because it's one of the few units in the list that can actually use the faction orders. And their faction orders, I find, are quite versatile enough that it really makes those units a lot more versatile. So I don't tend to take up that extra slot by removing a trademark weapon for that. But with Steel Warriors, yeah, so similar to what Luke said, although I normally mix mine with one autocannon and one missile launcher because there's not many pinning weapons you can get in the Forge Fighter list.
That's great because it gives you the pinning utility with your main shots and advanced targeting in order to hit another unit over there.
Yes, I tend to mix it up with that, but then that's because I would also take a unit of militia, which then they could have the Crestison's Fury, which gives them an extra dice on the trademark weapons, so they gain 20 shots on that unit for like 90 points. So because of the list, I guess, and the orders is where I would sort of lean towards it. I don't think, for instance, basic Marines and GCPS, I would put special weapons in them again because, again, the orders for GCPS are quite good and require a lot of trademark, and I think you'd be diluting it to do that.
I did also think that. I'm loving the grenade launchers in my Maison. I'm actually surprised by the amount of extra punch I'm getting just from having the two special weapons, because the laser rifles are doing about as much damage as you'd expect laser rifles to do. But the grenade launchers surprisingly punch through. I underestimated them, and I'm now not removing them.
Yeah, so it's an average of 2.5 per hit. At AP1.
And if you're taking two, then you've got a reasonable odds of hitting with one.
Yeah, so on average, one's going to hit. Average 2.5, so 2 or 3 on the blast at AP1. You're sneaking through an extra wound or two for sure. And sometimes you're sneaking through 4 or 5 wounds.
Do you really need to in GCPS when you can have 3 Wolverines? A whole bunch of weapon teams?
Yeah, attack drone.
I guess it is the question of, for those Marines, what is their role? Is it their role to try and kill things, or is it their role to stand on an objective and live, and maybe put out just a little bit of supporting fire?
And in my list, that's exactly what it is. It's
fair enough.
It's to sit there and maybe do a bit of flashlighting and see how it goes.
And I guess for my Maison, I have so little else extra shooting. Everything is running forward, being gribbly at you that the Blackwing have to do the shooting.
Yep.
So yeah, fair enough. All right, well, that might bring us to the end of our discussion of list building. Let's jump into Overwatch. Luke, what's got you excited on the Firefight horizon?
Well, I was excited to see the awesome Matt Carmack STL that Mantic put out to help our friend from the Kings of War Rules Committee.
Isn't it a great model?
Yeah. So it's actually one of my favorite STL releases so far. I think it's an awesome model for an awesome guy. So I'm excited to print off one or more of those and paint them up. And I've got some thoughts about different ways to use it as well.
When my resin printer arrives, it's absolutely getting printed. Awesome. And will be my monocycle leader in my Blackwing. Excellent. What about you, Mike? That's exciting.
Well, it recently just dropped, and there's a campaign that's starting to run for both Firefight and Dead Zone. So looking to try to get a few games into that, start logging away some results in the campaign and see how that all runs. So that's quite exciting. Otherwise, as I said, it's a similar thing to what I started with at the beginning. I have a few events that I'm running around the place here in Brisbane and in Canberra. And that's kind of what my focus is on at this point in time, to try and make those as fun as possible.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm also very excited by the Dead Zone and Firefight campaign. Annoyingly, I've actually just started getting back into Armada as well, and I'm just going to have to park that by the side because I love me a campaign. And I'm excited by some of the narrative stuff that's coming through, and that this looks like the Council hiring Blaine in order to suppress some rebel activity. Oh, gee, I'd love to see Rebs in Firefight. I hear the arguments again that they're, little covert cells and so on. It suits Dead Zone, but I'm sure with enough corporate funding or anti-corporate funding, they could raise themselves a bit of a fight. Rebs were my first faction in Dead Zone, so I've got a real soft spot for them. I love the idea of the plethora of alien races all coming together, united in their hatred of humanity. I think it's as a faction, it's one that really sells the idea of an expansive GCPS. Because you do see a lot of game systems where 2/3 of the factions are humans or some variants of humans or superhumans or what. I love that Rebs bring a lot of extra alien races to the party. I'd love to see him in Firefight.
The law person here, I was just thinking, like, would there be as many Rebs as there would be Maison? Like, if you've got Maison Labs, and surely you'd be able to fit a Rebs in.
Well, I mean, I guess it's the thing with a lot of the corporate expansion that the more peoples that you dispossess from their home worlds, the more enemies you end up creating. And so I'm certainly not thinking epic warpath scale, but I'd love to see it in Firefight.
Yeah, they're a really cool faction. I really dig them in Dead Zone. My pick for the next faction would have been Nameless.
Who are also mentioned in the fluff for this campaign as well.
Yeah, right. And I love them in Dead Zone as well. But I think Night Stalkers have stolen their lunch a little bit, which is unfortunate. So Rebs would be my next pick for sure.
Excellent. Well, that has brought us to the end of another episode. So until next time, when you're list building, know which units are for killing, plan which units are for dying, and unleash controlled fire.
Hear the tale